Hello and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This is the landscape scene that we're going to paint today. So it has a few new elements, some sunset colors, reflection in the water, and then some buildings in the background. So keep it small and start by taping off a square, a rectangle that's horizontally oriented on your watercolor paper. I just use masking tape to do that. Keeping it small will help you to keep it simple, and it will speed up your process. So work about 4 inches by 6 inches or so. Once your frame is taped out, use a pencil and develop the largest shapes of the composition. So the first thing I'm going to do is put down the shape of the water. I'm just going to make an arc that seems like a natural flowing shape. And then for these buildings, I'll roughen the bridge first and then build those buildings right on top. They're starting as just simple boxes, and then these tree shape will swoop in just like this. And I have some rotunda buildings that peek through in the gap of these leaves. When the buildings are roughly in place, you can go back with a firmer hand and add the little details. But don't get too detail oriented because you don't want the painting to look busy. You want it to be fun and engaging. Let me take just a couple of minutes and get things placed accurately. Remember that in watercolor you always want to paint from the back to front. So the thing that we see in the farthest back is the sky. Now to get that orangey sunset look, you need to incorporate a lot of yellows and oranges into your sky. So I'm going to mix up some different yellows and start in one corner and just drag it right over the top of those tree branches and then work carefully around this building. And then I'm going to mix into that with a tawny pink and work that into some of these buildings a little bit lower. But so you're letting the colors mix on the page and you're incorporating a lot of those light yellows, pinks, and oranges. And then for the bottom half here, I just rinsed out my brush a little bit, and then I'm just going to fill it down so that I get a nice natural looking gradation from dark to light. Then that might be as far as I can go in the sky. I can go a little bit farther though because I have these bright similar colors in the water. They're just a lot more concentrated in the water. So I'm going to mix up some oranges and yellows. And then with watercolors, you have to preserve your lights, but you can always paint over the top with darker colors. So it's always safe to start with your lightest color. In this case, that is a yellow. So I'm going to scumble down across the water. Watch how I let my brush skip over the surface a little bit so that I have some of these light struck little speckles. Those lend themselves really well to a realistic colored water. And while that's still wet, I'm going to go into the forefront with a little bit of orange, and I'm also going to use that same color under the bridge. Now under the bridge it's going to get dark and shadowy, so I'll have to use some darks in there as well. But while the color is wet, it's a really perfect surface for letting all of these kind of bleed together. And so I want to do some of this work while the water is wet and the color is fresh. Really carefully I'll drop in a few vivid reds, but I don't want the reds to take over. And I'm just sort of dropping it and letting the color bleed out on its own. Now the sky and water is dry, so I can add some of those dark colors. So with my flat brush again, I'm just going to go and vaguely start to block in these large shadow shapes on the water. So I'll work on the underside of the bridge here. I'll make the large shape of the shadow of these buildings that's laying on the water. I'm just using the corner of my brush, and this is now one big piece that is connecting across from here to here. And I can also see some detail under the bridge in these different areas. The pillars are laying on the water, casting shadow. But then see, develop the darks right over the top. And I also see that this bridge in the foreground is fairly dark. So I'll lay an initial pass over the top there, and then break into that with some blues and reds. the same sorts of colors that you see in other places on the picture, and that will help tie the colors together to make it look as though there's one atmospheric condition that's affecting everything. And you're also adding some interest and a beginning hint of some texture on this walkway. Now we've come to the part of the painting where you need to be a little bit daring, because you have to give the impression of sunlight falling on these buildings. So it's going to be orange on the left-hand side and then fade into a kind of natural tawny brown color. And it's going to be a little bit tough. So you have to be daring with your colors and take a chance. And the first thing I'm going to do is to get all of these buildings just a little bit wet. Now when everything is wet, I'm going to dip my brush into an orange, and I want to work with fairly pure colors here. So I'm going to start with the light colors, and I'm going to focus on the left-hand side of those buildings. Remember, everything that's facing left is going to need to get a little bit of this orange treatment. Then when you're done with the orange, you can mix up another sunset color like a pink. Go over, add some pinks. Add some pinks in the bridge, add some pinks in these buildings, right next to the orange, but not overlapping the orange. I'm letting my brush kind of bop over the surface, stippling almost. And I'm going to go into this bridge as well, with the same tone. With this pink on my brush, I'm also going to go into the rotunda. Just keep it nice and light because it's farther behind, so you want it to look like it's a lighter color. Then, still wet, I'm going to darken up and move to a brown and an ochre. And the ochre color, I'm going to focus on the right-hand side. So the oranges and pinks were on the left, facing the sun. Now I'm darkening things up a little bit. And you have to be careful because you don't want to cover everything. Bump it up a little bit. And now I've come to a point where I need to stop because I'm not going to be able to get any clean edges anymore. The paper is too wet. So I'm going to let this dry, and then we'll go in with our darker colors and add some more details. This is nice and dry now. So what I want to do is preserve my little windows and some of the highlight edges on this building. So I'm going to do that with a little masking fluid. So that'll give me a little bit of peace of mind as I move into the rest of the piece. Once that masking fluid is dry, then it is a time for boldness. So I'm going to wet a flat and a round brush. I want to give the darks a little bit more punch. So I'm mixing up a dark with some blues and some reds to make it a little bit purpley. And then very carefully, I'm going to add this color, and I'm going to be careful about where I put it because I only want it to be on the shadow side of the building. And you want to make it sort of solid and sweeping and yet broken up at the same time. It's very tricky. So I'm going to focus on the dark shadow areas first. So around these rotundas, and then sort of link these shapes together into one large shape that is going to hold up better. And I'll punch into this with some pinks, and then do the same sort of work in the other areas like the bridge. So I'm going to darken up the flat part of this wall. I start with a flat swath of color, and then I always punch back into it with some more little beats of pinks, oranges, and tawny yellows, so that nothing stays flat. And I'll bring it all the way over in this bridge, the top of the bridge, and carefully shape the side of the bridge around these arches. What you need to be careful of is that you don't just sweep over everything and drown the color that you already have. Otherwise, there would be no point in making those light passes in the first place. But it's not going to look realistic if you don't take some time and care, especially with the small details. So the next thing I'm going to do is add some little rooftops and things like this with my small flat, and I'm going to go in carefully and add those small shapes. I'll add a little bit more shading to the sidewalk down here, and that dark shape will help to show that there's a wall and then a walking flat plane. Since I have this water, I want to make sure that I keep a little line of white right above the water, and that will separate the water from the land. I'm also able to straighten up any lines that may have gotten a little bit askew with that large flat wash, and doing that is going to help to add a little bit more realism and care to the drawing as well. I'm adding a shadow to one side of these arches, and I'm going to add a little bit more vibrancy in the orange on the water. And you can have a little bit of an indication of a door here and there. And those little details really do go a long way in making your picture look a lot more interesting. Alright, that's looking very lovely. So now I'm going to add some foliage and details in the foreground. So I'm going to wet my little brush, get some very dark paint on there, and then add some little tree branches. Those tree branches should come down in one movement. You want them to sort of circle around this rotunda. And then as you move to the foreground, add some red branches and make them a little bit thicker. I'm gonna let that dry for just a minute and add some foliage, which is just dotting some little dots down here in this foreground. Don't make them all the same size, and don't make them all the same color. I'm going to clump on some very dark dots here. Just sort of let my brush skip around on the paper, and then I'm going to add some very red ones. You need a variation so that it will look organic. And then I'm going to do the same sort of thing to add some leaves. Just dot in some reds, some lines, some dots. And don't forget to change colors so that you get a nice variety. And especially considering that there's a bright orange right here, you can imagine the sun coming right in this area, so I'm going to have some nice vivid orange leaves and bright yellows that the sun is just crashing in through right in this area. Larger shapes generally hold up better in a painting than small finicky ones. So you do want a variety, but don't forget that you need some large general shapes. And then down here I can add a few little stems. Then I'm going to add a little bit of dark to accent in this path here, something that will look a little bit more like cobblestones. Then I'm going to remove my masking fluid, and from there I'll know what final touches I need to take. I'm also going to do a little bit more work in the water just by picking up a dark orange and adding a few little ripples. Just some light lines. You put them down and then you let them be. When you are done, the last step is to remove that tape. Marvel at the beauty of your painting, and voila! So I hope that you've enjoyed watching this painting tutorial, and I certainly hope that you'll try it for yourself in your own studio. So thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to join me again next month for another painting tutorial.